Welcome to INSEAD Knowledge. Today we have with us Dr. Renato Orsato, a Senior Research Fellow at INSEAD, and Dr. Paul Nieuwenhuis, Director of the Centre for Automotive Industry Research at Cardiff University in Wales. So let me begin by asking you, is the automobile industry sustainable?
Well, in its current form, it's not sustainable. And as I explained in my presentation, the problem is two core technologies that it relies on. One of them is internal combustion, which everybody is aware of. The other technology is the all-steel body, which was developed by a guy called Edward Budd. So we tend to talk about the Budd paradigm. And both those technologies force you into very high capital costs, and that forces you into certain types of economies of scale that didn't exist in the industry before those two core technologies were introduced, which forces you into pushing cars into the market, whether there is demand for them or not, and really creates the whole oversupply problem, which is one of the reasons why the industry is unsustainable. In terms of solutions to the whole sustainability issue, they come up with alternative powertrain, alternative fuels and things like that. But really, in order to make the industry sustainable, a much more radical change is needed. Just a factory to put together internal combustion engines costs about $500 million to put together. A system to make and paint all steel bodies just before you can make one car costs about $1 billion to put together. Then you have the tooling for each model in that is different. So you're talking between $50 and $100 million just for the tooling for each separate model. So if you have a full product range, those tools cost a lot of money. So you need to produce in high volume to get your payback on those models. So there's this constant pressure on the industry to produce, get those costs down, get those economies of scale. And to some extent, I mean, it sounds perhaps counterintuitive. To some extent, what the market demands is of secondary consideration. So there is a disjunction, a disconnect between the supply and demand because of those chosen technologies. And it's very important that those are technology choices. Different technologies can be used to deliver personal mobility, personal motorized mobility. And that's an important thing. There are alternatives possible.
What we observe along the years is that the profit margins have been declining. So it's important to understand that the problems of the car industry today, that it's quite common for us, to think that the car industry has a problem. But these problems emerge much earlier than the financial crisis. So we are talking here that an industry that was in trouble much earlier than the financial crisis.
One of the graphs I showed in the presentation today shows the profit margin of General Motors. And in the 1920s, they had a profit margin of about 20%. And that gradually declined. By 1960, it had gone down to about 10%. And then by 1990, it was near 5%. And of course, now it's negative. Now, a lot of people think this is a temporary thing for just affecting General Motors. But in fact, you can get very similar graphs for other mass market players. And Toyota is a positive example. Toyota regularly has something that sort of pushes it up. But even for Toyota, the overall trend is downwards, and it needs a radical innovation occasionally to sort of push them above that zero line again. So we think it's a structural problem of the mass car system as we know it today.
Are all manufacturers suffering from the same problem? Are there exceptions?
Not all of them, no. I mean, some of them can operate at high margins. If you have a strong brand, like Porsche, for example, then you can command a premium, which compensates to some extent for lower volumes. BMW and Mercedes traditionally have also been able to charge a premium, so you get a bigger margin. But that's really by leveraging the brand. Now, we think that brand can also be leveraged for other things. But the inherent sort of business model underlying it is as vulnerable as it is for General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, everybody else.
The issue here is that you have to move from technocentric solution to business-centric solution. Because the issue highlighted by Paul today is that the main problems that the car industry face are fundamentally economic problems first, and they are a result of good decisions made in the past. Is basically the innovator's dilemma for Christensen. Is what you did in the past lock you in a certain way of doing things that didn't allow you to innovate when you actually need in the future. So what you need today is to rethink the car system and not just the car as a vehicle. So you have to think in terms of what is the main use for the cars and how you could actually decouple certain technologies embedded in the car. And we are talking here about eventually the propulsion systems and the vehicle body, and to create new ways of making viable the individual mobility eventually at lower costs and more sustainable. You need to come up with not just a new car model, but you need to come up with a new business model.
The problem is that the car industry we have today was designed for a different set of circumstances and a different set of rules. Those rules have changed, and therefore we need to change the system. But as Renato has pointed out, we're stuck with the legacy of the past. And it's really, I mean, we can think of how we can improve it, but it's the transition to a new system. That's the struggle. And this is, again, where solutions like Better Place, which can begin to mesh into what exists and then transform it, are a very good first step, really, and can bring us into a different... I mean, personal motorized mobility is something that will probably stay. But the car as we know it today is probably going to disappear.
So a technocentric solution is not the way to go. What we need is a more systemic solution, it sounds like, when you're talking about changing the business model, taking in a diverse number of factors, not just the engine.
We tend to think in terms of a very clear shift, from internal combustion engine to eventually electric vehicles. The reality is more complex. There are certain places that a small electric vehicle might just be right. There are certain places, I would say, the Brazilian ethanol program is a very successful program, and it's going to be very hard to compete in that market with a different kind of fuel because the infrastructure is there and things work well. The country is basically in an area that ethanol is cheap to produce, and then eventually you can go to a new generation of this kind of fuels. In other areas of the world, maybe in Europe, the logic of using electric vehicles makes more sense. The point that we have to understand is that we are not talking about shifting one dominant mode of transportation or one dominant mode of production of cars for another dominant system. We are talking about moving from one dominant, heavily dominant mode to a more diverse or more diversified system in which you have different vehicles, different mobility operators, different vehicles adapted to the job, a multitude of operators, including station cars, including car sharing systems, including players that today are very marginal in a system that eventually requires them.
When you have a technological solution, the industry implements it and people buy it. But changing the whole business model to be much more diverse than that, how do you go about implementing that?
The problem is that the current business model was designed to motorize societies. And as long as people wanted, say, 1 million Beetles a year, this worked. But even markets are more diversified. And the industry hasn't really replied to that. It has replied by adding cost to its production system, by creating sort of visual diversity. But in fact, we need far more diverse technical solutions. I mean, as Renato said, in different markets, you may come up with different solutions. Your hydrogen fuel cell example may well work in places like Iceland, for example, or British Columbia in Canada, or something like that. So we need to think in terms of those different solutions in different parts of the world. It's like thinking of a diverse ecosystem. The more diverse we can make our ecosystem, the more robust it will be. At the moment, the car system is to a large extent a monoculture. And we know from agricultural experience what happens in a monoculture. It's very vulnerable. It takes some minor changes. And the big change we're getting now is the need for sustainability, and the whole system can begin to collapse.
is there any way to predict how long this process will take before we have a diverse business
Well,
model?
we can see it happening today. I mean, until about 1985, all cars virtually were steel monocoques. Then we begin to see new products coming in, such as the Renault Espace, for example, which is a steel space frame with plastic panels on the outside. We see the Audi A8 with aluminium structure coming along. Jaguar now has aluminium structures. BMW is beginning to adopt them. We see more plastic cars, more plastic used on cars. So you can see that the traditional BUD, all steel body paradigm, is beginning to show a diversity in the market. Powertrain, the same thing. I mean, you can now get LPG cars, you can get CNG cars in some markets, petrol and diesel, obviously. You can already begin to see hybrid cars coming in with the Toyota Prius. So it's happening as we speak, in fact.
Okay, so there is some hope out there. We're not at
Absolutely, yeah. Would you say there is hope, Renato?
Well, well, the question here is how to make the automotive industry more sustainable. At the same time, we have a more sustainable transportation system. So you have to bring them together. In the past, maybe we had so much elasticity in the market, there was so much space that eventually a monoculture, was good enough. Today, maybe for most car makers, they have been trying, strategies along the way. Rationalization strategies, cutting costs and trying to optimize platforms, etc. But that is possibly not enough to get to the level of diversity, possibly the diversity of income that they need to keep operating. So you also have to consider the possibilities of going beyond car ownership. And a few years back, it was very difficult to talk about car sharing systems because they tend to be very clumsy. They tend to be small organizations organized by a group of people in a neighborhood. Well, car sharing organizations, if you look in the data, have been growing exponentially. The biggest car sharing organization we know today is Zipcar in America, and they have more than 300,000 members. It is still a very small number if you compare with the millions of drivers, and owners of cars you have today. But that just is a tip for the kind of markets, the kind of new avenues that the car industry could pursue, which is to generate revenue along the way during the use phase of the car and not just in a one-off sale.
That's a very important point, because essentially the existing business model of the car industry is a fire and forget. You put it in the market and then you forget about it. But in fact, if you look at the value stream of a car throughout its life, most of it is after the sale. And the car industry has largely ignored that. There is a bit of finance, a bit of insurance and things like that. But that's where most of the business opportunities are. And that's exactly how we should change the automotive business proposition, by focusing more on that value stream than on the upfront manufacturing side. The use phase, that's where the money is. And that's a difficult thing for the industry to get its mind around, because it means your car that you make just becomes a means, a tool to then run your business. At the moment, it's the essence, it's the only part of the business. But in future, it really needs to become the tool I mean, it's like a photo.
I'm sorry, but in the way that automobile companies would become more transportation providers.
That's right, exactly.
Than car manufacturers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think, again, he is a point to emphasize the diversity of the system. Car sharing is not for everyone. And people, one thing that we know that people don't like to downgrade. So car sharing possibly is going to be for you if you can actually upgrade if you use a very cheap small car, maybe if you can use a sedan, maybe that attracts you to take your family for a weekend away, or if even during the week do something different. We are not saying that every car maker should become a mobility supplier. There is a space for everyone. The issue here is that maybe it's not so intelligent to put so much effort into a product that has from 10,000 to 15,000 components, that has a huge and sophisticated chain of suppliers to get, to a product, to eventually to sell for, a discount price, and never get any revenue from that again. So maybe if you have a system in which you also optimize the vehicle itself, the use, maybe is intelligent because you're also optimizing the vehicle itself, but you're also generating a new income base. And I can give an example just to conclude. If you take a car, I mean a very sophisticated piece of engineering, most of these cars are actually parked, or they are parked 96% of the time. Most of the time, during most of the time, they are just in your garage, or they are in a parking lot in a city. When you're driving this car, most of people are driving alone. So you're talking about transporting a very heavy mass, a very big mass, to transport only one person. So the levels of inefficiency that we have embedded in the car system are so great that are obviously business opportunities along the way. Mm-hmm. So obviously you cannot force everyone to use the car only, to have 5 people in a car all the time. Obviously we're not talking about this. But you can have vehicles designed and used for specific jobs. You don't take a jumbo jet to go from Fontainebleau to Paris. You go in an appropriate vehicle. You change the vehicles according to the distance. But think in the way that you use cars. You take one car that can do 500 kilometers without refueling, that can take 5 passengers and the luggage, and you take this vehicle for a trip that is normally 50 kilometers away, and you're driving alone. So it's not exactly the kind of efficiency that we're looking for a system.
Thank you, Dr. Orsato and Dr. Nieuwenhuis. It sounds like the car industry is inevitably going to change within the next 5 or 10 years. It would seem, at least, be necessary, I suppose.
Yep.
So thank you for joining us again on INSEAD Knowledge.